train tracks hadn't been used in years. They lay beneath moss and wildflowers, half swallowed by time, winding quietly through the woods beyond the edge of the old town. Most folks barely remembered the trains that once came and went, except for a few old-timers who still swore they could hear a distant whistle late at night, long after the world had gone still. But for Jonah, a boy of soft steps and quiet thoughts, the tracks had always felt alive. He would often wander out past the orchard, past the crumbling fence, until he found the spot where the tracks curved into the trees like a secret being kept. And there he'd sit for hours, watching, listening, waiting for something he couldn't quite name. One late autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and turned the sky into a brushstroke of gold and rust, Jonah found something different. A shimmer, a glint, a single silver coin sitting right on the tracks, clean and untouched by dirt or weather. It was warm in his hand, humming faintly, as if it held a voice too small to hear. And just as he turned it over between his fingers, the wind changed. It blew soft and strange, rustling the leaves in a pattern that felt more like language than chance. Jonah stood, slowly, and looked down the tracks, and that's when he saw it. The train was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It wasn't old, but it wasn't new either. Its metal sides shimmered like moonlight on water, and its windows glowed with a faint blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. It wasn't loud, no whistles, no clanging wheels, just a low hum like a lullaby wrapped in steam. The door opened with a slow sigh, as if it had been waiting just for him. Jonah didn't hesitate. He tucked the coin into his pocket, stepped onto the platform, and climbed aboard. Inside, the train was impossibly vast. The corridor stretched far beyond what could have fit inside its frame, filled with velvet seats and lamps shaped like stars. The walls were lined with windows that didn't show the forest outside, but instead showed memories. Not just his own, but those of others. A girl chasing fireflies, a grandfather reading on a porch, a family laughing around a table. The train was carrying something precious, not passengers, but pieces of people's lives, bundled gently into light. He walked slowly, peering into each compartment. In one, a woman was dreaming with her head against the glass, a tear still shining on her cheek. In another, a child was curled up with a stuffed bear, breathing slow and deep. They weren't awake, but they weren't fully asleep either. They were in between, resting in the part of the night where dreams turn into stories and fears melt into warmth. The train was
At the very end of the train, Jonah found a small room with a wooden bench and a window that looked out into a sky full of stars. A man sat there, dressed in a conductor's coat made of dark velvet and threads that sparkled like frost. He didn't turn as Jonah entered. He just spoke softly, as if continuing a conversation already begun. The coin finds those who still believe there's something waiting in the dark that isn't danger, but wonder. Jonah sat beside him, the hum of the train a comfort in his bones. "Where is it going?" "Where you need to go," the conductor replied. "Where they all need to go. Each stop is different, each journey its own. But the destination, that's always the same. A place to rest, a place to feel whole again." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars drift past the window like slow-moving fireflies. Jonah didn't know how long they traveled, minutes, hours, maybe lifetimes. But when the train slowed, and the conductor finally stood, Jonah felt something inside him ease, not because it was over, but because he understood. He stepped off the train into a quiet meadow bathed in silver light. The wind was warm, and the grass bent gently as if bowing to greet him. Behind him, the train door closed with a soft whisper and vanished, not with smoke or sparks, but like a thought that had been completed. Jonah stood there for a long while, the coin still in his pocket, the hum of the train still in his chest. And then he began to walk, not toward something, but with something, a peace, a quiet joy, a knowing that some journeys aren't about finding answers, but finding rest. Jonah walked through the meadow long after the train disappeared, the hush of its departure still warm in his ears. The coin in his pocket pulsed gently, not with heat, but with memory, like it remembered more than he did. The moon was high, lighting the tall grass with silver threads, and though he wasn't sure where the path led, he knew the journey wasn't finished. In the distance stood an old iron gate, weathered and ornate, wrapped in ivy and stars. It opened not with force, but with a soft sigh, as if welcoming him in without question. Beyond it stretched a garden that had no edges, trees shaped like thoughts, flowers that shifted color with every step, and a breeze that carried lullabies from places Jonah had never been, but somehow missed. On a stone bench just past the gate, a figure waited. She was older than Jonah, but not by much. Her dress shimmered with the pattern of clouds before rain, and her eyes were the deep kind that held stories instead of answers. She smiled before he even spoke, and from her sleeve she pulled out something small and folded, a ticket. But unlike any ticket he had seen before, this one wasn't marked with a destination. No place, no time, just a name written in soft gold ink, Jonah, and underneath it only one word, rest. He sat beside her, not needing to ask questions. The air between them was soft and still, like the hush between pages turning. She told him the train didn't always take people to places. Sometimes it brought them to moments, moments they hadn't had time to feel. She said people often carried too much, memories they hadn't unpacked, sadness they hadn't named, love they hadn't let in. The train, she whispered, gives them the space to stop carrying so much. Jonah looked around. The garden didn't feel like a place made to stay, but a place to breathe, to let something soften. He didn't feel heavy anymore. He didn't feel confused. He just felt held by the sky, by the grass, by the quiet rhythm of his own heart. He reached into his pocket and touched the coin again, and for the first time it felt lighter. He closed his eyes and let his back sink into the bench. The stars above shimmered with slow confidence, and a soft bell rang far in the distance, not urgent, not calling, but inviting. And though the train was gone, he could still feel it, as if it was watching from behind the hills, waiting until he was ready again. Somewhere, far off, he knew others were boarding too, people with different names and memories, holding different kinds of tired. But here, in this moment, in this gentle garden with no edges, Jonah let go of needing to know where it all went next, and the world in return held him gently, just as he was. Jonah wasn't sure how long he sat in that garden. Time had folded itself into something soft and slow, like the way curtains drift when a window's cracked open on a warm evening. He watched the leaves sway on trees that shimmered like moonlit glass, their branches full of tiny glowing fruit. Every now and then one would drop silently to the ground and vanish into the soil, as if it had simply returned home. There were benches made of old wood and winding stone paths that didn't lead anywhere, but felt worth walking anyway. The girl beside him, the one who gave him the ticket, had left at some point, without a word, without sound, and yet Jonah hadn't felt alone. As he rose to his feet and wandered deeper into the garden, he began to notice curious things. Small objects appeared here and there among the roots and petals. A single button, an old marble, a hair ribbon, a child's paper crown folded at the edges. At first, he thought they were just pieces of time long forgotten. But then he knelt to look more closely and realized each one shimmered slightly in the light. Not reflections, memories. Each item seemed to hold a feeling, a moment, a story still alive in its silence. He picked up a little wooden whistle, the kind children carried on string around their necks, and as his fingers touched the worn surface, he heard a burst of distant laughter, brief and bright, like someone calling from the edge of a summer day. Every object in this strange place was something remembered, not by him necessarily, but by someone. A garden of things too meaningful to throw away, too quiet to demand space. Jonah wondered who had left them behind. Were these memories too heavy, or too sweet to carry forever? Maybe this garden wasn't a destination, but a resting shelf for what people weren't quite ready to let go of, even if they no longer needed to hold it in their hands. He continued walking, and with every step, a calmness began to settle into him. Not sleepiness, but a warmth that spread from behind his ribs and into his fingertips. He wasn't lost. He wasn't searching. He was simply wandering, and that, here, was enough. There was no pressure to move quickly, no need to explain why he was here. The garden didn't demand anything from him. It just offered space. And in the quiet between steps, Jonah began to understand something. Sometimes rest doesn't come from stopping, but from being somewhere that lets you simply be. He sat beneath a tree with bark the color of dusk and let his eyes fall shut, not from weariness, but from trust. The wind played with his hair, and far off he thought he heard music, soft and slow, like someone humming a lullaby from a train window far in the night. And somewhere in the garden, a new object gently appeared beneath a flowered bush, a silver coin, warm to the touch, a reminder maybe that rest is not forgetting. It is remembering in peace. When Jonah awoke, the sky in the garden had shifted. It wasn't darker, just different, like twilight had curled gently across the treetops and wrapped everything in velvet blue. The stars had begun to stretch awake above, blinking slowly like tired eyes, and the air carried the scent of something old and comforting, warm wax, a hint of smoke, and lavender in bloom. As he sat up, a soft light flickered between the branches ahead, low to the ground and moving steadily. Curious, Jonah rose and followed it, barefoot now, the earth beneath his feet warm and smooth like river stones. He found a small cottage nestled into the side of the garden, barely visible beneath curling vines and flowering ivy. Its windows glowed with golden light, and outside the door, on a wooden stool worn smooth by years of use, sat an old man. His beard was long and tangled like twine, and his coat was patched with scraps of sky-colored fabric. In his lap he held a lantern. But not just any lantern. This one had a gentle flame that swirled with colors like memory, shifting from soft rose to amber to pale sea green. The light inside didn't flicker like fire. It pulsed as if breathing. The old man looked up and smiled. not surprised, not startled, but as though he'd been expecting Jonah all along. Without a word, he motioned to the stool beside him. Jonah sat, and they listened to the quiet together for a while, watching as another lantern appeared on the cottage's porch, lighting itself without touch. Then another, and another. Soon the whole garden around the cottage was aglow with hanging lanterns, each one glowing with the hush of a memory that wanted nothing more than to rest. The man finally spoke, voice like wind through hollow logs. "They come here when the heart is full," he said, "too full, with wonder, with ache, with things they haven't had time to feel." He tilted his head toward the lantern in his lap. "This one's nearly ready. It just needs a few more breaths." Jonah didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. He could feel it, that quiet work, that tender tending. The man wasn't collecting light. He was caring for it, honoring the pieces people left behind, not as losses, but as offerings. There was something holy in it, something deeply gentle. And though the man didn't ask for help, Jonah reached out and held the side of the lantern warm beneath his palm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They sat there as one more breath passed through the glass, and the flame inside steadied. The old man smiled again and set it gently on the porch among the others. For a long time, Jonah and the keeper simply watched them flicker together, their lights mingling, whispering quietly to one another like old friends telling stories by firelight. That evening, as the stars grew sharper and the lanterns cast soft halos across the garden floor, Jonah noticed something stirring above the trees. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, just clouds brushing across the sky. But then he saw them more clearly, lines, tracks, glowing ever so faintly, like silver threads sewn into the night. They stretched overhead in quiet curves, looping through constellations and bending toward horizons that no map could trace. It was a railway in the sky, impossibly high, yet pulsing with the same hum he'd felt on the ground. The old man followed Jonah's gaze and nodded, slow and knowing. "That's where the deep sleepers go," he said, "the ones who've wandered far into their dreams. The train rides higher for them, quieter. It takes them to places they're not yet ready to remember, or places they've long forgotten but still belong to." Jonah stared upward, eyes wide, as a soft light began to roll along the silver sky tracks. It came slowly, silently, the shape of a train only half visible, like a shadow drawn in stars. Each window glowed, some dim, some bright, all carrying someone through their night. As it passed overhead, he felt a deep stillness settle in the garden, like every leaf and lantern was holding its breath in reverence. The old man handed Jonah a small telescope, its brass frame etched with runes that shimmered when turned toward the heavens. Through the lens, Jonah saw the passengers, not faces exactly, but the feelings of them. A girl clutching her grandmother's quilt, a father rocking a baby that had long ago grown, an old woman sitting beside a memory of her younger self. They weren't asleep the way people think of sleep. They were traveling, moving through the soft corridors of longing and rest. Jonah lowered the telescope and looked back at the old man, who now sat quietly, eyes closed, a hand resting on another unlit lantern. "Will I ride it someday?" Jonah asked. "Maybe," the man replied gently, "but not yet. You're still here, still watching, still learning how to hold the quiet." As the train faded into the clouds, the stars brightened again, and the lanterns around the cottage resumed their soft dance in the wind. Jonah stood there for a long time, his heart beating in rhythm with the sky above, the earth below, and the peace that seemed to hum in all things. He didn't know where the sky train was headed, or when he might be ready to board it himself. But he understood now. There were many ways to rest, and many places that carried it gently to those who needed it most. The next morning felt different, not heavier, not sad, but full, like the air had thickened with meaning, and every footstep Jonah took stirred up a kind of quiet magic that had been sleeping beneath the soil. The old man had vanished by the time the sun stretched across the garden, leaving only a note pinned to the bench by a small silver pin. It read simply, "There's a door that only opens when you stop looking for it." Jonah folded the note into his pocket and wandered beyond the lantern trees, past the memory-lined paths, through patches of glowing moss and whispering grass. He walked without thinking, without trying to find anything at all. And then, just as his thoughts softened into stillness, he saw it, a door. It stood alone, not connected to a house or a wall or any structure at all, just a tall wooden door in the middle of the clearing, framed by nothing but sunlight and stillness. It was painted a pale shade of blue that seemed to change as the wind moved, and carved into its frame were tiny symbols, some familiar, some impossibly old. Jonah didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and gently turned the handle. The air changed as he stepped through. Inside was a single room, circular and quiet, wrapped in warmth. The walls were shelves filled with tiny objects, buttons, drawings, stones, pieces of string, dried flowers, small books with blank pages, each glowing faintly from within. And in the center of the room stood a chair, soft and wide, facing a round window that looked not onto the garden, but into memory. Jonah sat, and the window came alive. It didn't show images like a movie. It showed feelings, the echo of his mother humming to him when he was too young to speak, the smell of rain on the windowsill the night he first saw snow, the way the air felt in his chest the morning he'd watched his grandfather plant a tree. And then, smaller things, his first scraped knee, a library book with a secret note tucked inside, a firefly landing on his thumb. Tears rolled down Jonah's cheeks before he realized they were coming. Not out of sadness, not even from joy, just from being seen, from remembering things he hadn't known he'd forgotten, from feeling all the gentle pieces of life that had tucked themselves away for years, now floating back like fireflies on a summer night. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just breathed, and the room breathed with him. Time didn't pass in that room, not the way it did outside. It folded and drifted like petals in water. Jonah wasn't sure if he stayed for minutes or hours or days. All he knew was that when he stood again, the shelves were glowing a little brighter, as if his being there had left a trace, a kindness, a light. He stepped out, closed the door behind him, and when he turned around, the door had vanished. And yet, the warmth of it stayed. By now, Jonah knew the garden didn't loop the way a forest trail might. Every step forward revealed something new, not because the garden grew, but because he had. The world around him shifted gently with each quiet breath, responding not to time, but to presence. And today, as he walked with the morning light spilling through golden branches, he came upon a path made entirely of stitched cloth, a soft, winding ribbon of woven fabric, scraps of shirts, handkerchiefs, blankets, scarves, all sewn together, stretching out before him like a memory quilt unrolling into the distance. He knelt and touched one of the patches, a square from a child's school uniform, initials still inked faintly in one corner. Another square bore a burn mark, and another had a name embroidered with shaky thread. These weren't random pieces, they were remnants, things once worn, once loved, now gathered here, not as leftovers but as guides, as if each person who had ever passed through this garden had offered a piece of their journey to light the way for someone else. Jonah followed the path. It made no sound underfoot, only a soft give beneath each step, like walking across the lap of a beloved elder. As he moved, he noticed that the air changed too, richer, deeper, like old perfume and rain-soaked books. Every few feet, small wooden signs jutted from the soil, hand-carved with simple words. Breathe. Pause here. You made it farther this time. He stopped at a sign that read, Right where you are is the only step that matters. And without thinking, he sat down. Around him, the garden stayed still. The stitched path didn't rush him forward, didn't call him to the next place. It just was. And Jonah, in that moment, understood something he hadn't before. The garden, the train, the lights, the rooms, they weren't separate places. They were parts of the same map, drawn by hearts learning how to rest. This path wasn't one he needed to finish. It was one he was allowed to stay on, because some journeys didn't lead out, some led in. He lay back, his head resting on a patch that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. Above him the sky drifted slow and pale, and for the first time he didn't wonder what was next. He simply let the path hold him, and it did. Jonah awoke from his rest on the cloth path with the sense that something was calling, not loudly, not urgently, but with the quiet persistence of a breeze tapping gently at a window. The garden had darkened to twilight again, stars peeking through the canopy in soft constellations that flickered like thoughts just beyond reach. As he stood, the stitched path faded gently beneath his feet, as if it had finished its work for now. Ahead, nestled between the base of two ancient trees, he noticed a round opening in the earth. It wasn't hidden, but it hadn't been there before. It was framed in stone, rimmed with ivy, and pulsed with a faint golden glow from within. Jonah didn't question it. His feet already knew where to go. He stepped down into the tunnel, the air growing cooler with each turn of the spiral staircase. The walls were made of smooth, dark roots, woven together like braids, pulsing softly with warmth. They didn't feel like walls so much as veins of something living, gentle and old. The further he went, the more the silence around him began to hum. Not music exactly, not voices, just knowing, a soft murmur that didn't need language, the kind of sound that comes when someone who truly sees you says nothing at all. At the bottom of the staircase, Jonah entered a round chamber lit by hundreds of little candles. None of them flickered. Their flames held perfectly still, each one nestled in a tiny hollow, formed by roots and stone. In the center of the room sat a shallow pool of water, perfectly still, its surface glowing with soft blue light. The air was heavy with quiet, but not in a way that pressed. It held him like a hand resting gently on his back. He knelt at the edge of the pool and looked in. What he saw wasn't his reflection. Not exactly. He saw versions of himself. Not dreams, not imaginations, but memories of feelings he had carried. Himself at 7, staring out the window after hearing bad news and not knowing how to cry. Himself at 11, laughing too loudly in a moment of fear, so no one would notice how his hands trembled. Himself not as images, but as truths, raw, soft, unspoken truths that had stayed curled deep inside. The water shimmered and changed again. Now he saw people he hadn't known he remembered. An old neighbor who always waved from her porch, a boy who had once shared his crayons at school, a teacher who had paused before speaking as if she understood something Jonah hadn't said. Each glimpse was brief but full, and with each something loosened in his chest, as if small knots he had long forgotten had finally come undone. A root shifted slightly beside him, parting just enough to reveal a small wooden box tucked in the earth. Jonah opened it and found inside a piece of parchment with just 3 words. It was held. He didn't know what exactly it meant, but he didn't need to, because somehow down here, beneath everything, with the whispers still circling the room like lullabies, he felt it. Every moment he thought he'd lost, every small pain he thought no one saw, every quiet hope he once feared had faded, had been held, not erased, not fixed, just gently carried. Jonah stood slowly and looked around the room one last time. Then he began the climb back up, step by step, carrying nothing but the warmth of that knowing in his bones. The garden would be waiting, but he, now, was different. Not heavier, not lighter, just more whole. When Jonah returned to the garden above, dawn was just beginning to stretch across the sky, painting the leaves in soft streaks of rose and gold. But the garden itself had grown quieter, not in silence, but in reverence. The kind of hush that wraps around you when something meaningful has happened, even if you can't quite put it into words. He stood still beneath the canopy, the memory of the whispering room beneath the roots still echoing gently inside his chest. And then he heard it, a bell, but not like the ones you hear in schoolyards or clock towers. This bell didn't make sound the way the world does. It rang through him, not around him, a vibration, low and ancient, that passed through his ribs and spine and settled somewhere behind his heart. It wasn't urgent. It didn't ask him to hurry. It simply invited, and he followed. The path before him was soft, lined with fallen petals that shifted with the breeze like sleeping butterflies. At the edge of a clearing stood a tall structure made of dark wood and stone, simple but beautiful, like a tower grown from the earth itself. At its peak, carved into the wood, was the symbol of a bell with no clapper. Above the door, a phrase had been etched deeply, "For what still needs to be heard." Jonah stepped inside. The room was circular, like the one beneath the roots, but taller and filled with hanging chimes made of glass, brass, and old river stones. They didn't sway, and yet they pulsed with the same stillness he had felt in the bell's call. A small desk sat in the center, and beside it a tall man with eyes like ash and hands covered in ink. He looked at Jonah and offered a faint nod, not one of greeting, but of permission. Jonah approached, and the man handed him a slip of parchment and a small piece of charcoal. "Right," the man said softly. "Whatever was never said." The words came slowly at first, then faster. Jonah didn't write sentences. He wrote feelings, questions he'd never asked, apologies he never gave, things he never had the courage to admit even to himself, hopes he still held, fears that lingered in his chest like shadows. He filled one slip of parchment, then another, and another, until the writing itself became a kind of breathing, not for anyone else to read, just to be released. When he was done, the man took the slips wordlessly and placed them into the chimes, not to burn, not to discard, but to echo. As they touched the chimes, each wordless message sent out a single, gentle tone, quiet and clear, like a thought finally allowed to finish its sentence. And though the chimes didn't move, the room filled with a kind of music Jonah had never known before, a sound not of melody, but of understanding, the music of things finally being heard by something deeper than ears. Jonah stood there, still and tearful, letting the bellless ringing pass through him like sunlight through a curtain. He didn't need to hold the words any more. They had been given, and they had been received. When he left the tower, the garden greeted him not with applause, but with peace, a deeper peace than before, the kind that follows not just rest, but release. And for the first time in a long time, Jonah felt like nothing inside him was hiding any more. Everything that needed to be heard had been. Jonah wandered back through the garden one final time, not as a boy searching, but as someone who had gently gathered every part of himself along the way. The lanterns were glowing softly now, dimmer than before, as if preparing for sleep themselves. The sky above was the deep blue of early nightfall, speckled with stars that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the earth below. Each path, every door, the whispering room, the tower of echoes, they no longer called to him. They simply watched, the way a friend does when you're ready to go, but not quite ready to say goodbye. He returned to the place where it had all begun, the edge of the old tracks that first carried him into the unknown. And there, sitting quietly beside a new stretch of rail, was the train, not glowing, not pulsing, not humming like before, just waiting. Its windows reflected the starlight, and the door stood open with quiet patience, not asking anything of him, but offering everything. Jonah approached slowly, the coin still warm in his pocket. But as he reached for it, something told him he didn't need it anymore. He was no longer the same boy who clutched it in wonder and fear. He had walked the garden. He had listened to its silence. He had become the very light he had followed. Instead of boarding the train, Jonah did something he hadn't expected. He turned away from it and walked toward the lantern trees. He stopped beneath one of the oldest branches, the same one where he had once watched someone else hang their glowing memory. And now, in his hand, was a lantern of his own. It hadn't been given to him. It had grown inside him. Slowly, with each step, each still moment, each truth whispered in the soft dark. He hung it gently on the branch. It flickered once, uncertain, then steadied, casting a warm amber light across the grass. He stood there for a while, watching it sway slightly in the breeze. And then he smiled. He had left nothing behind. Not really. What he had done was leave something for someone else, a quiet light to guide the next soul who wandered in with tired feet and questions too soft for words. The garden didn't end when he left. It would keep blooming, keep glowing, keep listening. When Jonah finally stepped back onto the path that would carry him home, the garden didn't vanish. It just faded into a softness behind him, like a blanket gently being folded and tucked away until needed again. And in that quiet, steady dark, beneath a sky full of songs and sleep, Jonah's light remained. Good night, little one. Let your own lantern burn gently through the night, and may all that you carry find rest in the hush. between dreams.